Welcome back to Hospitality Talks. I'm your host, Abid Butt. We are thrilled to have Hala Matar Choufany, the president of HVS Middle East, Africa, and South Asia, with us today. With more than 20 years of experience advising governments, investors, and developers on hospitality, tourism, and real estate projects. Recognized as one of the hospitality industry's leading voices, Hala has advised on thousands of projects and is widely respected for her expertise in strategy, investment, valuation, asset management, and governance. A sought after speaker and industry thought leader, Hala serves on multiple international boards and advisory committees and has received numerous accolades for her contribution to hospitality and tourism. We look forward to learning about her global perspective to leadership, investment, and sustainable growth in hospitality sector. Good afternoon, Hala. Thank you for joining Hospitality Talks today.
Good morning, Abid. It's a pleasure.
Well, Hala, we will dive right in. You are based in Dubai. You have seen the market development throughout Middle East. We will talk first and foremost about the geopolitical issues that the region is experiencing today. Hopefully, this will be behind us before too long. But can you reflect a little bit on what the investor sentiments are? Is the industry still pretty positive as far as the outlook is concerned?
Sure, Abid. I mean, you skipped through the part to say that we've actually known each other for 20 years. And that's important for the audience to know, right? I mean, more than
Very
2
true.
decades.
Very
And
true.
a lot of work has been done in the Middle East and potentially also some in Africa. But to your point, I guess definitely these are uncertain times. And it has impacted certain markets, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But, these geopolitical uncertainties have very much become a norm, I would say, unfortunately. There's always something that is either at national level or regional level or even globally impacting the sector. Has the investor confidence shifted? When we compare that, for instance, in particular to our 2020 COVID and the investment survey that we conducted back then, clearly the outlook is much more positive. I think there is an acknowledgement that this is not a demand shock; it is rather temporary. And as soon as this conflict is behind us or comes to a resolution, I mean, naturally, it will take some time for these markets to recover to what was an exceptional and phenomenal year for most countries, whether in the Middle East or Africa. I mean, if we look at the 2025 in terms of occupancy, demand growth, pipeline rates, I mean, rates have been for 3 years consecutively increasing significantly. So overall, there is an acknowledgement in particular markets, which clearly is impacting in the immediate near term some of those projects. But ultimately, the overall, I would say there is quite confidence that, as soon as this conflict has been resolved, that there will be a quicker return to normality. How does that compare to COVID? I mean, many markets took 3 to 5 years to recover, depending on their, the dynamics, the infrastructure, transport. With the current conflict, as soon as this conflict is behind us, it's only a matter of, I would say, probably less than 12 months. But every market is different, so we can perhaps talk about that further.
So, thank you for that, Hala. Are there any learnings that we can deploy from the past cycles that might be applicable today during this conflict?
Well, in line with what I said about the uncertainty, if we look at mapping out a 20-year trend for this region in particular, and when I say region, okay, Middle East, North Africa, less so Africa, but Middle East and North Africa, if we map it out, there is oftentimes disruption caused by different factors, whether it is political, whether it's economic, whether it is related to medical diseases. And what we have learned is that these markets do recover. How you manage it is also extremely important in the process. So how you manage the conflict, how you manage the turmoil, the management of it, the building of the confidence, both in terms of your guests, but also with the investors, is extremely important. What have we learned is that it's important to be prepared always for a plan B. And I think oftentimes when we're in the high, we tend to forget that only within a year or two, there's going to be something that will cause disruption. And disruption can be temporary, can be extended. Disruption is caused from different, sources. So how do we become as an industry more agile? How do we make sure that we are after the right segmentation, after the right diversification? And this is exactly one of the learnings or findings of when we look at what's happened currently here in the GCC is markets like Saudi Arabia, particularly say Jeddah, Mecca, Medina, Riyadh, to some extent, because of the diversification, they were able to fare better. Clearly, domestic tourism is a very important segment. Countries that do have this domestic tourism should look after them. That's what I typically say. Do not replace them with the international markets. You always need that balance. And we've seen that in COVID as well. So I guess, yes, there is recovery, but those that recover faster are those that have been preparing for the next downturn. And as soon as we're out of this, I think we should go back to the drawing board and making sure that we are planning better for the future.
Well, you bring up a very good point. The markets that have domestic travel in the mix can fare better. That was very, very apparent during COVID. The world had shut down, but the markets that could rely on domestic travel really did rebound a bit better than relying on international travel. You've also talked about Africa. Africa has been discussed for the longest time as the next frontier for tourism development. To most of the people today, Africa is known for safari type of travel. Reflect on African development, and if you would help us understand what has been the development. How is the infrastructure faring to attract the foreign visitors or even regional visitors? And how does Africa prepare for social unrest or a pandemic or any of these market shocks, if I may use that terminology?
Right. So, I mean, to qualify as well, Africa in the context of what we're comparing to, because Africa as a continent, and because we're talking about all the success stories, or that we're much more familiar with the success stories in the GCC, whether it's the UAE, next is Saudi Arabia, Qatar has clearly developed quite aggressively over the last 10 years. So if the comparison is with what the GCC has been able to achieve within, whether it's a 5, 7, 10-year time frame, it wouldn't be a fair comparison. It's always important to remember that the economics, the investment profile is very different between Middle East and Africa. And that is a fair comparison because then it allows us to appreciate the little or much changes that are happening in Africa. I mean, in the context of comparing it to the GCC, they may seem limited, but I can definitely, while we can list many of the ongoing challenges in Africa, we could celebrate some of the changes that were made. We could also applaud certain governments for actually being more committed and trying to find the resources and the funding. I mean, today, as we're recording this podcast, there's a big event taking place in Angola that needs to be recognized. I mean, on the back of that, naturally, there will be further investments. If we look at South Africa in particular, the way they have been expanding the air capacity, airlift into South Africa, whether it's Cape Town or Johannesburg, clearly the numbers have been increasing. So there has been changes there. There is more investment, and we are very much involved with whether it is transaction work or new lodges that are being developed or resorts. Looking at, for instance, North Africa in particular, clearly Egypt is leading the way now in terms of development, and there is many projects both in Cairo itself but across the entire coastal line. So there's much more that is happening in Egypt today than 5, 6 years ago, including changes to, the visa requirements, airlift capacity. Ethiopia, they're at the forefront of, the airlift and increasing capacity. So there will be many examples of improvements that are being made, both on the um, in the sense of travel and infrastructure, airport expansion, airline and air capacity, but also in terms of the offering. Now, the change that is anticipated is not as fast as what we have witnessed in the GCC, but also by comparison, where we sit today, whether it is in Dubai or potentially we're seeing Saudi Arabia develop, building the right infrastructure requires a proper ecosystem, requires massive investment from the government. And then it does take a good 15 to 20 years to really be able to turn around a destination. So we're making good improvements, I would say, in Africa. But the challenges are still there. It is on the back of also the confidence, investor confidence. I mean, there are other challenges, certainly. But specifically to your point, because you did bring up the safari, and clearly that's what Africa offers that elsewhere they can't, right? So this is a very different positioning, and that's a great differentiating factor that they can build on to grow. They need to be able to appeal not just for the lovers of safaris, but naturally to appeal. And interestingly, some resorts actually in Africa, there are quite popular amongst the different source markets, be it from the US, from Asia, from the Middle East. But there hasn't been enough marketing, and I guess accessibility remains one of the biggest problem that they do face in Africa.
So, Hala, we'll stay on the market diversification for a bit. When you think about Africa or Middle East, there are a couple of markets that immediately come to mind. Of course, your home base of Dubai, they've done an incredible job with connectivity, and kudos to Emirates Airlines for bringing the world to Dubai. If you look at Jordan, whether it's Dead Sea or Petra comes to mind immediately, or from African point of view, as we talked about, whether it's Kenya or South Africa or Morocco or Egypt, that from tourism point of view, people have been visiting these destinations? Are they new emerging destinations? Are government really placing the importance of developing tourism sector to gain foreign exchange and make a difference in their GDPs?
Absolutely, especially in the African countries. I mean, they're looking to increasing the contribution from this sector to GDP. Perfect example is Egypt with the devaluation and fluctuation of the currency. And I mean, we're visibly experiencing that. So I guess to answer the part around the government plans are there, the commitment is there, the financial commitment is probably what is lagging.
In Africa, are there any particular challenges that the investors should be aware of in light of the conflict, or just generally speaking, when you are evaluating projects, and there are thousands of projects that come across your desk, how does the investor underwrite the risk premium, and how do you make that work in favor of the project?
And that's probably the most challenging part for development in Africa. It goes back to financing and underwriting those projects. Now, clearly, the same risks do exist across different markets. It's all a function of your risk appetite and returns. Arguably, we are still seeing investment in Africa, but with the expectation of much higher returns that you cannot potentially realize in a more mature markets. Now, again, depending on the industry, because there is much investment, foreign investment into Africa, but perhaps not necessarily as much into the travel sector. But we know in many other sectors, I mean, clearly Africa is very well established with foreign investments. But and I don't want to generalize because there are different issues that impact different markets in Africa. The biggest concern has been repatriation of funds. That's what we typically face. The legal nature of the title deeds that has been a common concern across many different countries actually in Africa. And therefore uh, generally speaking, the laws governing those investments. So this has really played against those investments, like for like. But the opportunity is there. It's really a function of being able to navigate. Ultimately, is the identifying the right investment opportunity and potentially looking at reducing risks through packaging some of those investments. When I say packaging, is potentially looking at also building other real estate assets that could potentially support. Hence, why we are also seeing that a very common model of the Middle East now is being copied into creating communities and mixed-use schemes in Africa, which naturally also allows you to mitigate some of the operational risks and other type of financial risks that are typically locked into developing a hospitality asset.
Well, thank you, Hala. Africa has a lot to offer. We talk about Africa as a homogeneous continent. It's quite the contrary. There are so many different destinations. It's a culturally very rich continent. Topography is unbelievable and it has a lot to offer. Are governments providing incentives to the investors for foreign investment to come in to these different countries in Africa?
I mean, there are some incentives. I wouldn't be able to outline the different initiatives. I know, for instance, in Angola, I've had discussions with the ministry. There are incentives in place equally in Kenya as well. And Morocco, definitely. There are initiatives. I think the initiatives today still haven't created enough investor confidence
Fair
to the
enough.
level that investors would feel comfortable investing in those markets.
Fair enough. Well, we'll shift gear a little bit, still talking about development. If you look at the Middle East or GCC region, and now looking at Africa as an emerging and developing destination, GCC has predominantly led from luxury assets. All luxury brands are present there. There continue to be more that are coming in. Let's first and foremost address what is luxury to you and what is it the consumer is looking for today.
Actually, you make a very good point because as you started the question, I was going to say, Abid, can we define luxury, please? Because I've realized that, that we use the word luxury, perhaps not lightly, but to describe anything that is fancy, that is different, that is, that potentially creates a different experience. And the reality, we haven't been doing enough justice to what luxury is. And interestingly, and, that's where we probably want to spend time, is it the rate that defines luxury? Is it the experience itself? Is it the facility? Is it the interaction? So there's different elements, but ultimately, in my personal opinion, luxury is where you're able to find that perfect match between providing an experience, extending an exceptional service, and leaving a very good impression, and which results in someone coming back and back again or recommending. The challenge has been with luxury and with the development of all these assets. I mean, you gave the examples of Dubai. That's true. We've seen the same in Doha. We're seeing that in Saudi. We're seeing the same now in Egypt. I guess because I've worked in so many different emerging markets, it's pretty much follows the same trend. It's all the luxury brands that come into the market when demand is pretty much still limited, but with high purchasing power. And then as you realize that you want to attract different segments and you could want to grow the demand base, then you need to develop other type of assets. And then comes your mid-scale and your upscale and your extended stay. And more recently, we're talking about lifestyle. But the reason I said what defines luxury is because I have been recently we were valuing a property in Marrakesh in particular, and it's a luxury property. And when we looked at the comparable market, I personally was extremely surprised to note that the average rate in 2025 of the luxury market in Marrakesh is 3 times more than the luxury market in Dubai. Now, in everyone's mind, including mine, right? Dubai as a brand is perceived as luxury, let alone the hotels that are quite luxurious in Dubai. But actually, luxury hotels in Marrakesh are able to command 3 times the price of what we're able to command here in Dubai. That speaks to a number of things. One, it's the number of hotels in the city, your demand base. But more importantly, I think it also speaks to the experiences, to the differentiating factor, and to the size of these assets. For most part, the assets that I was referring to are relatively small, where you can actually extend the service, you can pay the attention. So I'm not sure how I've answered you, but I think I think I'm struggling with making sure that a very good hotel is not necessarily luxury. And if we start using the word affordable luxury, just to make it sound that there are different levels of luxury, personally, I think we should be shifting to experiential destinations at any price point, right? Because you can still have a good experience without paying for super luxury, and you can equally have a super luxurious experience. But to the point of Africa, for instance, in particular, because we mentioned earlier on safaris and lodges. I mean, these command extremely high rates as well. It
Yep.
is the entire experience, it's what they're offering, and the ability to actually keep your guests happy for a number of days. So it's a very different than your transit in and out, staying for a night or two. I've answered with many different tabs here, Abid. Bring me back online. Bring me back online. Where do you want me to focus?
So, look, staying on that topic of luxury, generally speaking, and of course I'm generalizing, a lot of the markets lead with trying to attract high net worth individuals, which fits the luxury brands to lead coming into the market. Luxury, in many ways, was something that you don't have access to every day. It's got to be more than what I do in my daily routine. So if there is a proliferation of luxury brands or luxury positioning, does that still remain luxury? Or then we have to go to a different level to really distinguish through service, through experiences, through accessibility as to what luxury is. And mind you, to your point, that in turn also goes to the developers and investors if they can charge higher rates and if the hotels and resorts are performing better, their returns are better. How do we take control of the luxury positioning and from a purist point of view? And I tend to be a purist.
Yeah, you make a very good point, and that's why I said earlier on, I think you need to be able to establish the right balance between the investment made and the service that's being delivered. And oftentimes this is where the disconnect. So it's not also just a function of overspending, because oftentimes those projects are overspecified and there is an overspending, which you then expect that by increasing the rate because of a certain brand, you will be able to compensate for the investment that was made. But the question is, you've positioned the asset as luxury. Is it being perceived as luxury? And that is where the biggest difference lie in the minds of those that are well traveled and have experienced luxury. Because at the end of the day, it's not about what I say, it's about how you feel about that experience. Personally, yourself and myself, we've traveled enough times, we've stayed across different asset types, and we could turn around to name only a few where we felt this is real luxury, irrelevant of the brand and the classification in terms of the experience itself. Now, there is also, oftentimes a confusion between a great service and luxury. That is not to suggest you only get a great service if you're staying in a luxury property. I mean, great service is something that is owed to all clients. But with luxury, there is a higher expectations that you're attended to, which brings me back to my first point around how, and your point actually, Abed, how do we do luxury with those very large assets? How do we maintain their experience itself? How do we deliver on the promise of luxury? So personally, now when I'm having those conversations, I'm typically the very first question I ask the client, please tell me what brands you have in mind, because that will help me understand what your interpretation of luxury is It helps us also determine the right investment, the right area program, what, and potentially who are the operators. Oftentimes you'll find that, their definition of luxury is mainstream 5 stars. And there's nothing wrong with this, but it's
That's correct.
just not luxury,
Fair
right?
enough.
So it's not
Fair
just
enough.
luxury. It's like, wellness and spa.
Yep.
Oftentimes there is
Yep.
also the confusion between those terms. I mean, wellness is one thing, spa is something else. But I recently have been very much introducing the concept of ultra luxury because I feel that for most part, luxury has been overused in the way it's being communicated, it's being documented. So perhaps today, those individuals in particular, they're looking for an exclusive experience. And these are the ultra luxury brands that very much still maintain this feeling of wanting to be there and that it's not accessible and that it's quite exclusive. And this is really what continues to define them in particular as those up there in the diagram of luxury. Yeah.
Sounds good. I think that's a great segue to this next segment of wellness. That is a booming market. We've come a long ways from wellness perspective and spas. For the longest time, if you had a recumbent bike or treadmill in the basement and maybe one treatment room, you could call it a wellness facility. Where is the market headed? What's so unique about the wellness that makes this sector resilient?
I mean, there has been a lot of evolution to, also the wellness experience, right? If we look 10 years ago at some of those studies versus today, what you can include under wellness, I mean, many of it is not necessarily heavy or expensive equipment. A lot of it has to do with longevity and better sleep and, health. But I guess where the misconception is that to the point that a spa is great for treatments. A wellness is a facility where you're actually there to spend time to look after your well-being, both well-being, physical, mental, and therefore it is structured in a very different way than when you're actually delivering a spa experience within a hotel. And that's where we also spent a lot of time trying to make the distinction that typically what we observe with wellness resorts, it is the wellness being the key component that drives, and that is the key segment or segmentation is all around wellness. With wellness as well, it's a very different profile of guests. It's a very different booking window. The entire aspect of wellness is quite different to the way we have traditionally thought about hotels and bookings and services. To answer you, and I'm still actually trying to find myself, an answer to that because we've studied many wellness projects in this region. It makes sense if you look at wellness resorts in Asia or even in Europe, further away in the US, a large portion of their inbound guests are from the Middle East and particularly from the GCC. So if you can offer a wellness facility within 2-3 hours flight, that is straightforward, right? I guess it has to do with a number of factors, including clearly the climate, the experience, the location, and because it is not just about the facility itself, it's about the surrounding, it's about really being able to deliver a holistic experience. Um, Perhaps it hasn't gained the popularity yet or the attractiveness. It is capital extensive as well, not as diversified as you would with your hotel assets, where you could potentially figure out your revenue streams in a way that it's your F&B, it's your meeting space, it's your weddings, it's your rooms, and then with a wellness facility, as I said, yes, you can have multiple models within wellness, but the whole facility is designed in a fashion that really speaks to a wellness guest versus your traditional guest.
So, from the projects that you have recently seen, does the additional investment into longevity and wellness facilities, does that return on investment is still healthy, or is it a fad today and will be on to something else tomorrow?
It is very much similar to what we're seeing with other type of hospitality developments. I wouldn't necessarily describe it as less attractive. I would probably argue that it is still perceived as more risky on paper.
Okay.
In terms of the investment into those projects and the returns, they are pretty much mirroring what you would expect from a resort development in the right location with the right segments, or with a conference or corporate hotel. But the investment tends to be quite extensive if you're doing the right wellness facility, not so much. And again, this is where I think, are you looking to creating the experience in the wellness and public spaces, or are you spending much more in the rooms where at times it's not necessary, and really striking that balance? The bigger challenge in what I've seen with those projects is trying to do a number of things to mitigate risks and overspending. And this is where oftentimes projects, whether it's wellness projects or other types of projects, you've overspecified the investment, you've overspent, and therefore it becomes very difficult to achieve those returns.
We'll stay on the investment side of things with the rising capital costs, with the traveler demands increasing, and you just alluded to that sometimes developers overspec, and then the returns become a bit of a challenge. Are you seeing more upper upscale or mid scale or select service or focus service brands coming into Africa and Middle East? That's the first question. And my second question would be, are you seeing a uptake of independent hotels versus branded hotels?
On the latter part of your question, I wouldn't necessarily think there is an increase in independent hotels over branded, especially in markets that I mostly work in. On the contrary, there is many independent hotels that are finding it's becoming much more competitive, and therefore they are looking for a brand. With that said, we are also observing a different trend to your traditional HMA, and that's where those established hotels, even if they're local brands, they are looking for a better manager, perhaps, and a better distribution system, and they see therefore the benefit of being able to plug into one of those platforms. So what that means is not necessarily that we're seeing more independent hotels, but we're definitely seeing more opportunities for franchise agreements and TPOs. Now, Africa in general, when compared to the Middle East, has been way ahead of the Middle East in terms of the franchise model. I think today we see many more discussions happening with franchising models in this region. It also has to do, I think in this region, it has to do now with the fact that many of those investors have become quite sophisticated. They have built their in-house capabilities and therefore are able to manage. In Africa, I would argue that it was the operator's strategy, because they found it extremely difficult to actually operate and hire, and therefore they were willing to offload that responsibility, right? So there were different interests, but pretty much we're arriving to the same result. But to your question more on asset type, we're definitely seeing more of a pipeline now in the what we call affordable, mid-scale, upscale hotels. But if we still look at specifically the emerging market, I mean, I've just been in Egypt last week, and we were also speaking at a webinar and looking at the numbers. Most of the pipeline is still coming in with what is defined in the traditional way luxury. So the question is, again, I mean, you do have a 50-60% of the domestic market. Can they really afford all that luxury? And back to the point, is luxury in what you invest or the experience that you can deliver? But this is not necessarily, so this is quite common. Where we're seeing more of the real estate trend is in building those mixed use schemes, where it is a number of assets, potentially a 4-star and a 5-star, potentially a hybrid between your extended stay and transit business. Many more with the branded residence component, and whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense. I'm happy to open a separate bracket on that, because I have an opinion on branded residences. But this is where we're seeing more of a shift in terms of the approach to hospitality. The understanding is that clearly, if you have access to the right plot and the right areas and BUAs, that you bring in an integrated project which supports the different hospitality components, fills up your restaurants, occupies your meeting space, and then you're able to also play into different segments of the market.
Fantastic. Well, we'll shift gears a little bit, Hala. Let's talk
You don't want to talk
about.
about branded residence? You avoided that question. You thought I had an appearance like an art.
Well,
Keep it.
truthfully, a lot of the projects are only being underwritten on the back of branded residences. Whether it actually pans out that way or not, the jury is still out. But a lot of the resort
100%.
developments are
Yeah.
being underwritten with
Yeah.
the real estate sale. Any
Yeah.
thoughts
I
on that?
agree. No, I agree. And this is where, time will tell, but there are operational challenges in the future. What happens when you actually terminate an agreement? There's a lot of complexities there. And very few markets, to be honest, were successful with branded residence. I can give you many examples of cities with great projects they weren't able to sell. So again, I think it's one of those things that is quite trendy at the moment and it's hype, but the reality, it doesn't mean because it just worked in a particular market, it is a
It
concept
works
that you
everywhere.
can replicate. You really need to also understand the investor profile, right?
Makes
So,
sense.
yeah.
Makes sense. Well, let's talk about leadership. You have dominated and occupied a space that is typically filled with male gender. Tell us some of the successes that you have had as you have found a front row seat in looking at these markets and evaluating thousands of these projects that you've been doing over the last couple of decades.
So, Abid, I'm at times struggle with how I answer this question, and I'll tell you why. Because I think really what had supported me at the start of my journey is coming from a family that really believed, despite being Lebanese, but really believed in the girls and their abilities, and therefore the females. And I joined also a company. I mean, clearly prior to HVS, I had different roles, but I also joined HVS, a company that really supported female leaders. And many of the partners within the HVS family are females. And I always mention that because that really speaks to the culture. So, what I wanted to say is that I think that my base is solid enough that has enabled me to really, both on a personal level but also professional, to feel that I am as qualified. I've had experiences, and that had to do with the age when I was much younger working in Europe. And then when I moved to China, it was more of a cultural, potentially difference in accepting a female leader. And then I actually had less of that challenge in the Middle East, believe it or not, unlike what people may think. I mean, there has been few instances. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that what you said is incorrect. We can be doing more, but I also recognize that in the last 15 or 20 years that I've spent in this region, there is way more females that are in the room today and they're making their way. So it's something to celebrate, and we have the responsibility to continue mentoring and supporting them. Both individually, but as companies. I mean, at HVS, I continue to assess based on credit. And yes, if I have the opportunity to hire a female and develop her into the future female leader, I would be very supportive of that because that's the experience I had. But what I wanted to say is that it's not one of those topics that I have really paid so much attention to because it's not, and that's at times what worries me. It shouldn't be perceived as competitive. uh, for me, the what is important is being able to demonstrate capabilities and building that confidence and that credibility. And this has really, in my mind, played in favor of my ability to advance my leadership again in different markets. Africa now is a very much new frontiers for me. It's like 4 or 5 years that I've been spending more time there. But I'm just going by genuinely what I have applied throughout my last 20 years. And it seems to work every time on every occasion that you really need to know your markets. You need to have those right conversations. And when you do, then shouldn't be a problem in being able to reserve yourself a seat at the table.
Well, look, that speaks a world of you, Hala, first and foremost, regardless of the gender biases that exist. But women in leadership roles, it continues to be a challenge globally. It's not just the Asia, Middle East, Europe, whatever the case might be. It is still a challenge, maybe more so where cultural nuances come into place, because hospitality, even now in certain parts of the world, is not a recognized career. We've come a long ways growing in the industry as an apprentice to having education. It is being recognized as a career, but there are a lot of geographies that it is still new and culturally not well accepted. So thanks to you for leading the way. Any wisdom that you would like to impart on younger people that are trying to enter the hospitality and travel and tourism industry? Anything they should be more focused on?
Yeah, so I mean, I want to agree with you when you said challenging because I don't want to sound like I've dismissed that there continues to be challenges, but potentially those challenges are common, right? Depending, as you said, geographies and cultures. I think what is extremely important is, on one hand, is the commitment of the individual, and that plays a whole difference, irrelevant of gender, but more importantly, having worked with many females, because there seems to be a conviction that we just need to try harder. So try harder because that comes through, and I've sensed it on a number of occasions, and it makes a whole difference. But I also think it's an extremely important conversation that we should be having with the companies, the way they employ, and the flexibility that they are putting in place for those females to feel that there is an opportunity to progress, that they're not being judged, and that they're being supported. I always talk about the support system. Now, support is, on a personal level, you have, and that's how I managed to actually work and have a family. It's my family support, which was so important, but also the company, the support that is available there. And I feel as as employers, we're not doing enough. That-
Fair
That's the
enough.
truth. I think we should be doing much more to ensure that we're onboarding the right people, but once onboarded, and if they're value add, that we really need to make them feel comfortable, and that, it's okay to have a life outside of work, and that this is appreciated, but that shouldn't get into the way of how you progress within
Absolutely.
companies. Yeah.
To that point, Hala, if I could have a sneak peek of your calendar, what would the work-life balance look like? What would show up on your calendar, blocking time for the family versus the business travel that you are constantly pursuing?
To be honest, I've stopped chasing the perfect balance because I've realized life is not perfect. I'll be very honest with you. And the more I was trying to orchestrate that balance, the more it became frustrating. But definitely one thing I agree, the question about the calendar, what appears on the calendar is what is the priority. And therefore, I oftentimes say, time management, it takes a lot of time management. It takes a lot of identifying what the priorities are. So today's my calendar looks very different to 10 years ago, Abid. And I think what I'm trying to stress is the fact that my priorities today are possibly different to my priorities 10 years ago. When my kids were much younger, I did work very hard, but I promise you, the priority to attend every event and to even fly back midnight so I can show up at school the following day was the priority. Today, there is more that is taken away by work because I could afford to do that. They're much older. But in general, I am a believer that the balance, if we're not using the word balance, is finding or striking some sort of a balance between your personal life, wherever that is, and it could take any form, and your professional life is extremely important. And that's what I actually try to lead the team with. I'm not the first in, I'm not the last out. I ask them to try not to work on weekend. There is no expectation because I think it's also about role modeling. And it's about actually appreciating that if we're not able to identify the priorities, and those priorities keep shifting. Today's priority might be attending to a medical situation, and next week's priority is something different. And we owe it to ourselves. So I would say my calendar is very much a reflection of my priorities. And it hasn't been easy. There are times where you feel that it's getting a bit too much. And that's when you learn how to actually also say no gracefully. Um, because I mean, you leave me to my speed, I want to do even more. But sometimes I have to talk to myself and say, okay, you're exaggerating. You have to.
Well, look,
Slow down.
we've all struggled with it. Honestly, my wife was the one who would say, "Hey, look, if it doesn't show up on your calendar, I'm sure you're going to book another appointment and another appointment, but it needs to be on your calendar, whether
Right.
it's just having a dinner at a reasonable time with the family." And believe it or not, it does work. If it
Oh
shows
yeah, it
up on
does.
the calendar, it
100%.
it does work.
100%. Yeah.
Keeping to the talent, is the industry doing enough to develop the bench strength, particularly with the technology that is being deployed in the industry? Are we attracting enough of the future leaders into the industry so that the industry would continue to flourish?
Yeah, I was going to say that, I mean, clearly, globally, it's challenging attracting the right talent to our industry. It wasn't perceived, and I think you hinted to that earlier on, it wasn't perceived as the sexiest industry or where you really have the opportunity to grow. I would argue that the industry has grown uh, significantly over the last 20 years. So when we talk about the hotel industry, I mean, you clearly, the podcast is Hospitality Talks. So hospitality now, it's there's endless opportunities in how you invest and how you work within the industry or how you support the industry, right? So I mean, it's leaning towards real estate, leaning towards services. So I think the real opportunities do exist. The challenge of finding the right people, probably there's enough people out there, but it's all a function of your commitment. And you've used the word future leaders. I guess where we are still lacking is how are we ensuring that we're developing training and, more importantly, retaining people and preparing them to become the future leaders. And technology is there to support us. I mean, there's no doubt, and we should take advantage of that. But that, especially in the hospitality industry, that will create a lot of efficiency. But hospitality is driven by people. It's not driven by technology. So it's the people industry, right? But we also need to show that commitment to people and support in their future development. So I guess we should be doing more with future leaders. Some organizations actually are doing very well. They have a very strong corporate culture, I'd say. They're loyal, and as a result, their people are loyal back. You've got situations like we're experiencing nowadays where there is a disruption. It saddens me to see that many groups have, would immediately let people go. This is not how we invest in people on the long run, right? I mean, that's where you need to show more commitment if you really are looking to keep those future leaders to run through the next 10 years and 20 years of any company's cycle.
The industry definitely is at a crossroad. We do need to be able to attract the future leaders. The millennials are not necessarily attracted to this industry because when everybody else gets to play, we have to work. And that doesn't settle in well on holidays when the hotels are busy or the destinations are busy. So the industry needs to rely on almost the pop culture to attract the younger audience so that it'll continue to thrive. Hala, we're approaching the end of our conversation. Just some quick fire questions, one word answers, if you would. What's the common misconception that traditional real estate investors have when they try to enter into the hotel asset class?
That it would typically yield double-digit growth as other industries they have invested in. And it's usually always a comparison with the oil industry, and we both know it's not. Uh, I guess I would also add that they underestimate the operational challenges with the hotel versus any other real estate. So
Fair enough.
it looks great as a guest, not so much as an investor and a
Well,
manager.
it is a very attractive and very a sexy asset class. We all have enjoyed as a guest going to
Mm,
these places. When you put the professional lens on, it's a different
true,
story.
true, true.
What's the biggest threat to hotel valuations in Middle East and Africa?
Overspending, I would say,
Okay,
recovering
okay,
many of those investments. Yeah.
okay. A bit of inside story from you. If you had 100 million to invest, which type of hotel would you invest in?
Can I say I'm packing up and leaving? All right. What would I invest in? But see, I'm gonna answer. That means I will pack up and leave because I would invest in a small boutique resort, 40, 50 keys in a very unique location. But I would want it to have different facilities. I've actually spent a long time thinking about how we can have hotels across different geographies, but not in the traditional form of hotels. So that would be a concept I'd like to develop more.
Okay, fair enough. And is the star rating, the 4-star, 5 stars, 6 stars, or however many stars we want to put on, is that classification still relevant? True or false?
I think it's outdated, to be
It
honest.
needs to be developed.
It's outdated. It's not unified, right? Your 3-star in Dubai is very different to your 3-star and now you've got global travelers. So
fair enough.
yeah.
So last question for you, Hala. You have not only traveled professionally all over the world, you have evaluated thousands of projects that has come across your desk. When you walk into a hotel, maybe as a guest, not on business travel, and if you could possibly take your professional hat off and just leave the guest hat on, what is one of the things that you notice first that tells you this hotel is being taken care of?
The attitude of the employees, very
Amazing.
much. Very telling.
Amazing. Fantastic, Hala. Great conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for
really
having me.
enjoyed it.
Me too.
And I'm sure our viewers would get a lot out of this conversation. And I look forward to having you back before
Sure.
too long.
Sure. See you in person soon, I hope.
Thank you so much.
All right, Avid. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.